Good evening, everyone. I'm joining you tonight from the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Canada's capital. Thank you for tuning in to one of our many online events as we welcome view and virtual visitors from around the world. My name is Dean Oliver, and I'm the Acting Director General of the Canadian War Museum. Canada's National Museum of Military History. We are proudly located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, with whom we work very closely. Acknowledging where we are is key to our ongoing relationships with Indigenous communities across Canada. Many of you are joining us from various parts of the country, and I encourage you to also take a moment to acknowledge the traditional stewards of the territories on which you reside. I would like to take the opportunity here to welcome our several distinguished panelists: historian Kathy Grant, Canadian Forces Captain Kevin Junor, Canadian Armed Forces Lieutenant Colonel Shelley Peters, retired, writer, professor, and poet Dr. George Elliot Clarke, Canadian Armed Forces Major John Redmon, retired, Russell Gross, Executive Director of the Black Cultural Centre of Nova Scotia, and our moderator, African and Caribbean community leader Sarah Onyango, who also hosts Black on Black on Saturday mornings on CHUO 89.1 FM. Thank you all for joining us tonight. The mandate of the War Museum is to collect and share the stories of Canadians in times of conflict in their personal, national, and international dimensions. We strive to ensure that our projects and presentations reflect the diverse experiences of the diverse perspectives, of Canada's historical experiences, not only by acknowledging them, but also by respecting and valuing the people such stories reflect. One project that embodies such personal stories is the exhibition A Community at War, the military service of Black Canadians in the Niagara region, presented here at the War Museum in partnership with the Niagara Military Museum. The exhibition tells the unique stories of 22 Black Canadians who fought for freedom abroad, even as they struggled against racial barriers that denied them equality here in their own country. I strongly encourage you to visit the exhibition if you have occasion to be in Ottawa in the coming weeks and months. Although tonight's discussion reflects the themes of our other programming for Black History Month at our two museums, the War Museum and the Canadian Museum of History, this event is more universal than a program marking a special month. Instead, it is a behind-the-scenes look at how researchers and writers work. What motivates them? What areas do they feel need greater exposure? How do they investigate perhaps lesser-known events or experiences from the past? And how can they link these to larger contemporary issues to create both a more equitable and accurate understanding of the past and a firmer grounding for a more equitable future? In 2022, the Government of Canada offered an official apology to the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion and to their families and descendants for the treatment that they endured before, during, and after their service to Canada during the First World War. This was a milestone, but it was also a turning point. In Canada, the wartime service of marginalized groups has too often gone unrecognized. What happens now that one form of recognition, albeit an important one, has occurred? Where do we go from here? Scholars, activists, citizens from diverse backgrounds and disciplines are exploring the intertwined issues of history, race, and voice exclusion. And tonight, you join that discussion. The War Museum is very proud to host this important conversation. I hope you find it stimulating and that it offers you new insights and perspectives. It is now my very distinct pleasure to hand things over to our moderator, Sarah Onyango. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. And good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Onyango, as you heard earlier. I'm also a board member of Black History Ottawa. and I'm very pleased to act as your host and moderator for today's event, Beyond an Apology, the Future of Black Canadian Military History. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to give a brief orientation of our Zoom webinar features. L'événement d'aujourd'hui est présenté en anglais avec traduction simultanée en français. Pour démarrer l'interprétation simultanée, cliquez sur l'icône du globe terrestre au bas de votre écran, puis choisissez la version française. Vous pouvez régler le volume et l'option de traduction à votre guise. If you have any questions for us, please use the Q&A tab. There's also an option to upload questions. Please leave the chat for general comments. Before we get to the main event, our panel discussion about the future of Black Canadian military history, we'd like to welcome Russell Gross, the Executive Director of the Black Cultural Center of Nova Scotia. He has been involved in the protection, preservation, and promotion of Nova Scotia's Black culture and history for over 25 years. Russell was instrumental to the official apology to the descendants of the No. 2 Construction Battalion in 2022. And although Russell is unable to join us in person today, we're very grateful that he has recorded a short video to offer some history about the No. 2 Construction Battalion, which should help contextualize the conversation we'll be having tonight. Following that video, Dr. George Elliot Clarke, prominent poet, author, scholar of Africadian literature, and the great-grandson of Captain William Andrew White, chaplain of the famed No. 2 Construction Battalion, will read the poem Black Soldier's Lament by the late retired Captain George Borden.
Greetings from Nova Scotia. My name is Russell Gross. I'm the Executive Director here at the Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia. So glad to be joining you virtually as you celebrate African Heritage Month, Black History Month, and of course, you think about the remarkable legacy of No. 2 Construction Battalion. I'm going to take you on a brief journey on the history of the battalion. I hope you enjoy it. At the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, many Black men felt the call to serve their country. These men were turned away. They were rejected due to anti-Black racism. Some men were told that this is a white man's war, and others that we'll send for you when we need you. Throughout this experience, Black Canadians were repeatedly denied the right to serve. Through over 2 years of lobbying and letter writing by Black community leaders and whites who did not support these racist attitudes, a solution was offered. In 1916, there was an urgent need for military labor units, and as a result, Canada agreed to a request from Britain to form a Black labor battalion. No. 2 Construction Battalion was authorized on July 5th, 1916. Recruiting began in the Maritimes on July 19th, and by August 30th, the battalion became one of the few units that was allowed to recruit across the country, the United States, and Barbados. On March 28, 1917, No. 2 Construction Battalion sailed from Halifax, Nova Scotia on the SSS Sutherland and arrived in Liverpool, England. The men were sent to support Canadian Forestry Corps operations in the Jura Mountains of southeast France. This included operating and maintaining the water system that supplied the camps, maintaining the roads, and helping to build a logging railroad. They were also directly involved in vital timber operations. Lumber cut by the men of No. 2 proved an essential requirement in the trenches along the front lines in France. It was used for riveting the sides of trenches, duck boards for the bottom of the trenches along muddy terrain, artillery gun platforms, railway ties, ammunition boxes, ammunition huts, and many more uses. Lumber from the Jura region was even used to build a fighter aircraft. The work of No. 2 allowed the mills in Jura to produce twice as much lumber as forestry companies without their support. Such was the testament of their determination. At the end of the war, most of the men from No. 2 Construction Battalion sailed for Halifax and were sent back to the provinces where they were originally recruited. Number 2 Construction Battalion was disbanded on September 15th, 1920, when the Canadian Exemplary Force was dissolved. The legacy of the battalion and the adversity they face became a distant memory. For decades, the story of Number 2 Construction Battalion was largely an unknown part of Canadian history. This launched a journey of research that started in the early 1980s by the late Senator Calvin Ruck, as he wanted to learn more about the remarkable battalion and their contributions. In tandem with Ruck's research was the research being done by the son of Number 2 Construction Battalion soldier William Gale in Montreal. Much of this research is still being built upon today. Annual recognition of the battalion began in 1983 with the Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia, under the leadership of Captain George Borden, developing an annual event at the historic Pictou, Nova Scotia waterfront, where the battalion was formed and headquartered in 1916. Other recognition for Number 2 in recent years includes the first scholarly work completed on Number 2 and a thesis completed by C.N. Foyen in 2000. In 2001, we saw the release of the short film Honor Before Glory, focused on the diary of Reverend William Andrew White, produced by Anthony Sherwood. In 2016, lobbying by descendant Robert Downey to Canada Post led to the issuing of a stamp to mark the 100th anniversary of Canada's Black Battalion. During the 100th year remembrance of Number 2 in 2016, a host of research, events, and programs took place across Canada to commemorate their contributions, including 100th anniversary of Number 2 Construction Battalion traveling exhibit created by Kathy Grant and Legacy Voices, and research contributions by Matthias Yost. In 2020, a roundtable discussion with government officials and descendants was held at the Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia, seeking a formal apology. 2 years later, on July 9th, 2022, the Government of Canada issued a formal apology.
How could they not be seen as heroes? As a country, we failed to recognize their contributions for what they were. Their backbreaking work, their sacrifice, their very willingness to put their country before their self. I am here today to offer the Government of Canada's official apology for the appalling way these patriots were treated. For the overt racism of turning Black volunteers away when they offered to sacrifice their lives for all, we are sorry. For not letting Black service members fight alongside their white compatriots, for denying members of Number 2 Construction Battalion the care and support they deserved, we are sorry. For failing to honor and commemorate the contributions of the members of Number 2 Construction Battalion and their descendants, for the blatant anti-Black hate and systemic racism that denied these men dignity in life and in death, we are sorry.
Today, we continue to celebrate the legacy and dedication of the brave men of Number 2 Construction Battalion through various forms of engagement and awareness. Our Canadian Armed Forces are working towards the importance of culture change and diversity through programs and activities. Earlier this month, the Canadian Mint recognized the battalion in a release of a commemorative coin. Long live the legacy of Number 2 Construction Battalion, an important part of Canada's military history.
is now my great honor to recite a poem by a wonderful serviceman, the late and lamented George Borden, Captain George Borden, and his poem, The Black Soldier's Lament. The bugle called, and forth we went to serve the crown, our backs far bent, and build whate'er that must be done, but ne'er to fire an angry gun. No heroes we, no, nay, not one. With deep lament, we did our job, despite the shame our manhood robbed. We built and fixed again to prove our worth as proud Black men and hasten sure the Kaiser's end. From Scotia Port to Seaford Square, across to France, the conflict there at Ville-la-Joux and Place Huron, for God and King to right the wrong. The number 600 strong, stripped to the waist and sweated chest, midday's reprieve, much needed rest. We dug and hauled and lifted high from trenches deep toward the sky, non-fighting troops, and yet we die. The peace restored, the battle won. Black sweat and toil had beat the Hun. Black blood was spilled, black bodies maimed. For medals brave no black was named, yet proud were we, our pride unshamed. But time will bring forth other wars, then give to us more daring chores, that we might prove our courage strong, preserve the right, repel the wrong, and proud we'll sing the battle song, and proud we'll sing the battle song.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Okay, and so now I have to come after that. Thank you so much, George Elliot Clarke, former parliamentary poet laureate as well. So we're going to start off the panel discussion by introducing all of our panelists so that you know who all are up here. Kathy Grant, an educator, public historian, and founder of Legacy Voices, ensuring that Black Canadian military history is documented and preserved. We also have Kevin Junor, who has served in the Canadian Armed Forces for over 3 decades, and he's a leader and a champion for diversity and inclusion. We have George Elliot Clarke, who you just met, who actually teaches African Canadian literature at the University of Toronto. Shelley Peters, this is history right here. She's a trailblazer in her own right in the Canadian military. She was the first Black woman to serve in the RCMP. In 2008, after 24 years in the military police, she retired as a lieutenant colonel. In 2009, Shelley was inducted as an officer of the Order of Military Merit, and she currently works for the Privy Council Office. And last but not least, wonderful gentleman, John Redmon, a former serving soldier of the 48th Highlanders of Canada, an officer of the Royal Canadian Regiment with over 43 years of service. I think there's almost 100 years of service up on this stage. That's the reason you're seeing so many medals. So we're going to get right into it. And we're going to start with asking all of you about your connection to military history, Canadian military history. We'll start with.
I'm John Redmon, and I think this is an ideal and wonderful opportunity for all of us to gather on this most important subject of number 2 Construction Battalion. I think the work that has been started has been marvelous. And I think the future, the way ahead is, I think the path is wide open. And I think the entire country will benefit from the work that's being done. I started my career in the 48th Highlanders of Canada in 1965. I joined as a private soldier. I continued my service until I transferred to the regular army with a commission and did the remainder of my service with the Royal Canadian Regiment. I do have a connection to number 2 Construction Battalion, in that my great uncle James Paris served with the battalion overseas. I never did meet my great uncle, but I did see photos of him, and the connection just through the history of number 2 Construction Battalion is there. I think that the role that we have to play now, and the role that I have to play now, is perhaps to educate myself further on the history of number 2 Construction Battalion, and be able to contribute in some way, shape, or form to the further study, the further education as part of the remembrance of number 2 Construction Battalion.
But John, you did mention when we were speaking earlier that you actually played a part in
I had
the apology.
I had the great privilege and honor during the tattoo, the Royal Nova Scotia International Tattoo in 2016. I had the great honor of being the coordinator of the scene that commemorated the 100th anniversary of the formation of number 2 Construction Battalion. And it was a great opportunity to meet service personnel from across the country who participated, and a great opportunity to review the history, the wonderful history of number 2 Construction Battalion.
Yeah.
One of the most moving aspects was when we gathered and we saw the film and reflected on the film, and I brought out a nominal roll of the former serving members of the battalion, and to see the eyes light up on some of the faces of people who actually recognized members of their family, and that was worth the entire trip.
Thanks for that. So, Kathy, your connection to Canadian military history.
Hey, my connection to Black Canadian military history stems from my father, Owen Rowe, who volunteered to fight for Canada in the Second World War. He came up in 1942 from the island of Barbados, along with about 30 other. And then there were about close to 300 Black veterans that came up from the West Indies. And the very first plaque honoring these soldiers is actually in the War Museum. And in 2005, we honored them right here at the War Museum. And before my father passed away, he made me promise to continue the story of documenting and preserving and sharing the stories of our Black Canadian veterans. And I have continued with that promise. I'm getting much of this information out into schools, to educators, to people across Canada, across the world. We have a Facebook page, and we also have, as of last year, a website, Black Canadian Veteran Stories. And as well as last year, we had a documentary, Black Liberators World War II, which focuses on the stories, first-person narratives of Second World War veterans. So it's education, letting people know about the history we were proud to serve, and that is my role. continuing the legacy of our soldiers.
Thank you very much. And a funny story, Kathy and I met at her father's funeral, and that's how I got involved in this as well. It's a story for another day. Mr. Junor, tell us about your your connection to Black Canadian military.
And you can see that just set the stage for the conversation. In 1980, I was running around Cedar Break Collegiate, and the recruiter came to me and said, "Do you want a job?" And I decided I would join for the summer, and the summer hasn't ended yet. But along my journey, I was blessed to become the regimental sergeant major for my unit. And that is the most senior non-commissioned officer's position. And while I was in that role, I was introduced to the history of number 2. And once I was introduced, I couldn't let it go. I realized that this was a rich piece of history that we had to pursue. The former minister, Harj Sajan, I saw him last night, and he came over to me and he said, "Kevin, thank you. Thank you for being my mentor and my advisor." So through introduction to number 2, and then connecting with the minister, whether that had anything to do with it, thank God that he was able to initiate the apology that we now have.
Wow, that's wonderful. Shelley Peters, your connection to Black Canadian history.
Thanks, Sarah. So as you mentioned, I had the privilege of serving in uniform for 24 years with the Canadian Armed Forces, and through that had a career of amazing experiences and a lot of firsts. But more importantly for me, I'm the daughter of Canada's first Black fighter pilot, Walter Peters, who was very much a mentor and a role model in addition to being my father. And, you know, through the work that Kathy has done and the work of the War Museum here, I've been able to learn a lot more about some of the struggles that he faced in the prejudice and the discrimination. So one of the highlights of my career was actually the last position that I held was the Director of Human Rights and Diversity. So that gave me an opportunity to really understand the struggles of the groups and our 4 employment equity groups, and understand that we all have to take the responsibility to make the change. So that's something that I've tried to do, tried to set the example, and in speaking with folks, just to let them know that this hasn't come easy. And we've done some of the work, but we need to carry on doing the work.
Mm-hmm. One thing you did forget is you kind of followed in your father's footsteps, because the late Walter Peters was the first ever human rights officer
He was
in the Canadian military or Air Force?
in the Canadian military.
In the Canadian military. There you go.
Thank you.
Mr. Clarke, your connection to Black Canadian military history and what you do to promote it.
Well, I think it begins simply with the fact that I'm the great-grandson of Dr. Captain Reverend William Andrew White, who was the first Black non-commissioned officer in the British Army, and who was, of course, the chaplain to the No. 2 Construction Battalion. So as a boy growing up in Halifax, I heard a lot about him, and of course his very famous daughter, Portia. And so they were both role models. And also I'm from Halifax. Halifax is the greatest North Atlantic naval base. There aren't any that come close to it, that rival it. And so growing up in Halifax, I was bombarded with military history, not Black military history, but military history. And coming from a city that was also wounded as a result of war, the Halifax explosion, December 6, 1917, I grew up as someone who, even though I'm in the arts and I'm more or less a pacifist and so on, I still ended up getting infected with all that military, glory and glamour and so on. And eventually, especially as I moved into my teen years and becoming a young man, I became much more conscious and aware the role of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And to finish up, I'll just say this: the great irony, and it was touched on in the apology last year, but there was a great irony for the No. 2 Construction Battalion. On one hand, Canada was at war in World War I, the Great War, in defense of democracy, in defense of human rights and liberty and justice and so on. And yet those very qualities were denied to Black Canadians and Indigenous Canadians and other minorities. And yet those Black men, despite the oppression that they undoubtedly faced at that period in Canada's history, flocked to join the No. 2 Construction Battalion to fight for real democracy, real justice, real liberty, since they already understood what it was like to be oppressed.
Mhm. Thanks very much for that, George. And that sets us up very nicely for the next question. We saw the video, we saw glimpses of what happened last year. So I want to get from each of you what it was like back there, because some of you actually were physically present in Nova Scotia for that apology on July 9th. We can start with Kevin. I saw you on TV plenty, so I know you were there. Take us back there. Take us back there.
You know, I saw the video and it took me back. I saw the Prime Minister of Canada stood before about 2,000 people, and he made statements, strong statements, like, we apologize for the anti-Black racism. The group of people that stood before him, they all stood up in thunderous applause because of the words that he used. Did I say the words that he used? His words wrote a check saying that we are sorry for what we did. However, we're at a point right now where that check cannot be cashed. The fabulous words that arouse the emotions of everyone, but yet still we are looking past the apology. And as far as I see it, is the day after the apology, somebody put on the brakes. And the momentum that we had on July 9th that went across the nation ceased to exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're gonna get back to that, because this conversation is about what happened after and what's supposed to happen after. But were you moved like everybody else?
I was pleased that the Prime Minister said the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was responsible for the relationship with the descendants. I was very happy for the descendants. They felt that this was a right thing to do. I remember individuals coming to me and said, oh my God, now I can relax. There is one individual who, after the apology, went to Africville, and he said, this has now come full circle. We now have the apology, first one to the Black community, as I know in Canada history. So he went through Africville, and he's now getting an apology from his forefathers, right? So he's old enough now, he said, I can go in peace. So I feel good that we were able to hold that together in such a way that the descendants felt satisfied. I felt good that it happened.
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave it there.
Kathy, you were there too. I saw you on TV as well.
Okay.
Take us back there, like what you saw, especially through your camera lens, because you were taking a lot of pictures.
The focus of the apology for me was witnessing the descendants and the care that was done for the descendants. So all of the children, because some of the children are still alive, so they brought them in golf carts. One of them, it was like their 90th birthday. And it's just seeing the pride. They incorporated in the apology music from the church. A lot of the members of the Black community are very deep in the church. And to see one person get up and saying, hallelujah, 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 it just hit me. And just seeing the pride, a person who I never met by the name of Padina Gale came all the way up from the States to attend the apology. Her father was Tamus Gale, and he documented over 1,300 Blacks that were in the First World War. So getting to see her and hug her and touch her, as well as see all of the descendants and make a connection with them, it made me proud and just a little bit deeply saddened that George Borden, who was one of the ones who pushed for the apology, had passed away. So that's what the
Wow.
apology meant to me.
Thanks for that. Mr. Redmon.
Sarah, I just want to say that I'm going to refer to Kevin's remarks, which were outstanding, by the way, Kevin. I agree that, yes, the check was issued. However, you did also mention that it seemed to be a situation whereby the apology took place and then everybody went home. From my way of thinking, the apology is just the beginning. It's the beginning of a long road to ensure that No. 2 Construction Battalion takes its proper place in the Canadian Army order of battle. There's a lot of work to be done. The apology is a start point, not the finish.
But you were there on July 9th?
Unfortunately, I was not there, no.
But you did observe it on.
Afterwards, yes.
Yeah. George.
It's hard to think of what to say.
Is there another poem?
Following these remarks. Well, not really, but one thing I can say is this, that in the history of Canada, especially the recent history, the last 30, 40 years, many apologies have been issued to various aggrieved groups of Canadians, righteously and properly and appropriately aggrieved groups of Canadians, for whom the apology itself was not the end of the story. There were forms of reparations suggested and presented and accepted by those aggrieved communities. And so I think that it's a matter of fundamental justice that African Canadians, Black Canadians, also receive a greater recognition of the sacrifices of our ancestors across many different sectors in helping to build this country. We need to remember that there weren't only just two founding peoples, according to that particular rhetoric, keeping in mind that the whole country is essentially indigenous in the first place, but there certainly were not only just two founding incoming groups of people. There was a third founding group, and that third founding group happened to be people who were enslaved under colonial Canadian governments. And we, the descendants of those persons who were enslaved, those persons who were segregated, those persons who were denied proper employment and educational opportunities, also need to be made whole, also need to have fundamental justice respected by appropriate measures being taken to make sure that we feel that our citizenship is actually respected as opposed to being suspected. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a George Elliot Clarke quotable quote right there. So that sets us up very nicely for my next question. I'm getting the sense that, yes, there was the pride, there was the emotion, etc., but sort of some dissatisfaction and sort of a letdown and an anticlimax to the whole thing. So I know for sure that Kathy and Kevin were involved in the group that was consulted in putting together the apology, and there were recommendations that were made. I think there were about 8 of them. So what should come next in terms of discussions and actions to remember and reconcile the past? You started alluding to it. And also, what should come next in terms of perpetuating the legacy of Black Canadian military service? Mr. Redmon, you actually started talking about this earlier.
Yes, the follow-on actions, particularly in regard to formal education. I think all of our publications that have to do with that era of the Canadian Army, the First World War, should be reviewed to ensure that all of the units that fought overseas, that were represented of all communities overseas, are included in that military history. I doubt very much that No. 2 Construction Battalion holds sufficient ground in that case to warrant education that I believe is required if we're going to be studying military history in schools, at high schools, universities. I believe that that is an action that is probably long overdue. Let's review the history to ensure that No. 2 Construction Battalion is well represented.
Kathy?
In terms of the apology and the 8 recommendations, I know that one of the recommendations that actually was put forth, there's a coin, a Canada coin. We actually have Kwame Delphus, the designer of the coin, in the audience. This is the 3rd coin that he has done, and it's a remarkable coin. So that's one thing that has occurred. Another thing that we like to see is a continuation of the story through education. I know that right now we're starting to see it more recognized in schools, but I think a lot more can be done, like the odd school here and there, but World War I history is mandatory, and I would like to see more of that story and beyond taught in schools.
Kevin, what other actions other than, you know, putting it in schools and putting it in, like integrating it into the teaching of World War I history, for example?
There is a concept of a mobile library.
Okay.
And the library will go into the community, and community members can enter that mobile
Museum.
and they can gain knowledge. I think at this point, one of the things that we can possibly do is to create a rolling exhibit, a rolling classroom of No. 2. I've seen in other communities where there's actually a bus with all the AV, audio, video that you need. You have a presenter, you have everything that you need for a mobile classroom. And this classroom is around No. 2 Construction Battalion, right? If individuals won't come to the Black Cultural Center and the War Museum, let's take the knowledge to the community so that they can enter at their own will, and we can promote this, and this can go coast to coast to coast, right? Not very difficult at all. And, you know, I respect the government and their decision-making process. And I'm sure that it is possible to find funds that would be able to create this rolling education for the country. Stop there.
That's fabulous, and an immersive experience that travels to communities.
To the community.
As opposed to, yeah, that's great. Shelley.
I think we need to do more events like we're doing tonight. The attention that this gets, the capabilities of social media to be able to spread the word of what has transpired, because the apology is important. The apology recognized the history. The apology has now gone down in history. And that's part of how we learn and we move forward, is from learning from our past. So you have Kathy's work, Legacy Voices, you have the testimonials that the War Museum is doing, and those are all important artifacts to be able to capture the history of our Black veterans, so that the ones coming after that have the opportunity to learn and understand where they've come from, where the military has come from, And as they are moving towards a more inclusive military in a more open culture, they need to understand where they've come from. So we put that in the military training itself. Let's talk about what this is. It's a difficult conversation, but we need to have it so that people will understand and that they can then do better.
Yeah, thanks for that. George.
Two things very quickly. Governments and societies will commemorate anything and everything that they think of as being important. The fact that Black military service has, up until the present, not been seen as being worthy of commemoration is a judgment of government and a judgment of society. So the counter argument to that is to remind everyone about the stakes involved in World War I and many other conflicts. But to come back to World War I, in a sense, that was a struggle over Africa, because the conditions for World War I and later for World War II were created by the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, which Otto von Bismarck called all of the advanced industrial nations of the world together in Berlin, 1884, 1885, to discuss how they could avoid going to war. And the way to avoid going to war was to award various parts of Africa to various European powers and empires, including Italy, including Germany. Of course, France got North Africa. Britain got a lot of territory that it wanted. Belgium got the whole Congo to basically wreck and ruin immensely, to despoil. And the consequence of that failed bid to prevent war from breaking out was, in fact, World War I. So ironically, Black people in Canada, Black men in Canada, rallying to defend Britain, to defend the Dominion of Canada, were also trying to say to Germany and to other powers, hands off of Africa. So in other words, I'm trying to say, in a kind of too long a way of saying it, is that African history is part of Canadian history. Canadian history is part of African history. So therefore, Black Canadian military service is part of an international story of Canada's commitments and involvements with Africa and its people, and peoples, plural, I should say. And so it is incumbent upon all Canadians to understand that deep connection, beginning with the transfer of the Maroons and the Loyalists, Black Loyalists and Maroons, to Sierra Leone in 1792 and 1796.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's deep. That's why I like having you on, because I always learn something new. You sort of, all of you sort of touched on, the ways to teach Canadians and Black Canadians about Black military history, but what to you is the most effective way to do that? Because not always are effective. And what does effective look like? Who wants to take that on? When will you know that it's effective? Whatever it is you're doing.
I always take that on. I find that getting in contact with youth and have them be a part of it. Start with one story or two stories and have them expand on that. I know that we're doing work, and I know that Library and Archives Canada, prior to the apology, they digitized all of the records linked to number 2 Construction Battalion, and they made them available online. And we shared these with teachers prior to the apology, and they started using that material. There's different organizations, whether it's like historic or whatever, it's putting it out there and letting the students learn and linking it. So I think that that is important to show a story, humanize one person. One story that I want to share, like we identified a soldier who was the first Black person to go to the University of Manitoba and study medicine. And he abandoned his studies to join number 2 Construction Battalion and went overseas. And then from there, the Canadian government sent him back to finish his education. And we were able to go and locate information on this soldier by the digitized records that was done by Redmon Archives Canada. So
Wow, that's great. Digitize and then humanize
yes.
by personalizing, right? Kevin, you have been involved in a lot of commemorative events. Kathy does the schools. You really do the commemorative. How effective is that?
I think it's been very effective.
Mhm.
For individuals to see a Black man who has been, I guess, successful, standing to talk to them about what it's like to be Black, what it's like to be able to face racism and defeat racism in the mind, because racism is going to be around for a long time. But we can't allow or give racism the power over us to hold us back from achieving our goal. So when I stand to talk to people, I tell them of some of the challenges, but I also tell them that I was a guy who stood outside the boardroom and I listened to the conversation of the people who control the boardroom, learn their conversation, so they would invite me into the boardroom until eventually I was a chairman of the board, right? That's the message that I speak.
I was thinking more in terms of when you go to Nova Scotia and you're actually at a monument or a memorial and you're commemorating. That's more what I meant. And the effectiveness of that, if at all.
And you know, I'm linking that also with regards to the events, because when I go to the events, I now stand there, as Maya Angelou would say, I rise, I rise, I rise. So I stand there in the uniform of the Canadian Armed Forces, and I let everybody know, without saying a word, that I now hold a rank, a commission in the Canadian Armed Forces after being a regimental sergeant major. And I've been blessed with not just medals that went on the tour of duties, but the Canadian Forces says, I'm going to induct you into the Order of Military Merit because of your service to country. That's what I show people when I go to those events. And they're saying, who are you? Say, let me tell you a story.
So it makes a statement and sort of marks, you know, someone's imagination. Shelley, what is the most effective way for you?
I think Kathy really hit the nail on the head, is that we need to speak to the youth. The youth need to understand, because at the end of the day, they are the collective, they have the power, and they will move this forward into the future. So for me, if we can get into the schools, have it part of the learning, part of the teaching, part of the understanding, then I think we are setting it up for success, because it then becomes a normal part of their life. It's not something special anymore, because it is just ingrained in what it is that they are doing every day. And I think that then, for me, would spell success.
So how does the number 2 Construction Battalion's legacy continue to inspire to this day? You actually, Mr. Redmon, you have a family connection to it. How does it inspire you today?
I find it inspiring because it actually it invites me to go back to my family history, and I have a lot more work to do in that regard. But events like this, the apology, and everything that's going to follow on, that's going to be good in regard to number 2 Construction Battalion, is going to empower me and give me the impetus to go and research my own family background more than I have in the past. And I think it's one of those things, I'm not the only one. Everyone will be affected by it in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's, from my point of view, that's how it's going to inspire me.
Kathy?
I think the coin is something that inspires me. I can touch it, I can feel it, it is textured. And I find that youth are attracted to the bling, the shine. We did a presentation where we had the Oscar Peterson coin, and they were fast. They said, well, by the way, last year there was a coin that was developed, and this year it's the #2 Construction Battalion coin. So that legacy, taking it on, and even beyond #2 Construction Battalion, there is First World War, Second World War, Korea, and beyond. So part of this is beyond. It's learning more about our Canadian story, which involves both the Black military as well as all that served. So I find that the pride that you see in students when they see someone that looks like them, and even that someone who does not look like them, to let them know that they serve, that is what inspires me. When you see the children say, oh, I didn't know that this happened. I didn't know that happened. And social media and digitization, I think, is what's going to continue to inspire kids today.
Thanks, Kevin. How do the #2, because they've been gone a while, today, to this day, they still inspire. How do they inspire you?
The fact that we had men who were told that it's a white man's war, we don't want you. If that was me, I would go home and sit back and have a coffee. But these men stood up and they said, no, I am equal. I want the opportunity to go on foreign soil to potentially spill my blood.
Mm-hmm.
That inspires me. That inspires me. And, you know, I joined the infantry. They were not allowed to be in the infantry. As an infantry officer, I would be one of those individuals standing at the front of all these men, where previously only a white man would be able to stand there. So I stand on the shoulders of these brave, proud Black men. So yeah, they inspire me to this very moment.
Shelley?
You know, the more I learn about it, because like John, I need to learn more. To be able to, in a small way, appreciate the treatment, the way they were demoralized, dehumanized, and they still fought for a country that didn't want them. So that's not that long ago. We're talking 100 years. That's not that long ago in the overall scheme of things. So for me, for a group of men to have done that and persevered despite the way that they were treated, to be able to contribute to this country, a country that they believed in, that inspires me.
And last but not least, George.
To build on everything that has been said in answer to this latest question, I would say that probably the most inspiring thing about the #2 Construction Battalion was the fact that they did go overseas, the fact that they represented a notion of internationalism, of humanitarian intervention, and not just on behalf of the British Empire, on behalf of the Dominion of Canada, but on the behalf of people of color from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Canada itself, from North America, from the Caribbean, in demonstrating our full equality and integrity, our own natal belief in the importance of representing and fighting for, championing liberty and justice and equality. The fact that people came from all over Canada, from the Caribbean, from the United States to join the #2 Construction Battalion and go overseas to France, which of course was under great assault on the part of the enemy powers and so on, was a statement of their belief in the necessity for internationalism in order to ensure proper humanitarian practices by everyone all over the world. And to do that at a time when most of the world was under the control of European powers. We forget that. But you go back 100 years, not even 100 years, you go back 70 years, the map of the world was essentially dominated by European powers and European satellites like the United States of America. So all those men 100+ years ago were actually fighting for the right of nations dominated by people of color to actually be able to control their own destiny by stating that they were, in fact, fully 100% human beings, and Darwin be damned.
Wow, okay, that's a good way to put a big exclamation point on our panel discussion. I thank you very much for all of your wonderful insights and your comments. And so now we're going to be watching a video that was made. You talked about education a lot, all of you. That was made in collaboration with the York District School Board. And we'll watch the video, and then Kathy will tell us quickly about the genesis of the video.
The soldiers of number 2 Construction Battalion were soldiers that volunteered. I think it's just very important to continue the story. We got Department of Defense in the year 2007 to formally honor the contributions of its Black soldiers. And we've been, like I say, honoring our soldiers for more than a decade. And the enthusiasm and the passion has not diminished at all. It's honoring our soldiers and making sure that students learn about them. Teaching history is different. It's not about always reading something in the textbook. And I know that with our stories, it's more about stories as opposed to the glorification of war. Everybody is interested in learning more about this part of Canadian history. And now there's more, there are many examples. There's images, there is primary sources. There's no excuse not to learn. And it's telling the story differently.
And it's time for the educators to realize that they should not just maintain the status quo of telling history from somebody else's perspective of how it's been told over the years. But now it's time to change the game. Change the game and telling history. Tell Canadian history the way it is. And a part of Canadian history is about number 2 Construction Battalion.
Tell us very, very quickly how you came to make that video.
There was an educator by the name of Rebecca Mitchell, who's connected to York Region District School Board, who was following our Facebook page, and she wanted to get these stories out. So they created a tool, a number 2 Construction Battalion Google map, where they plotted all of where they resided. And the kids are able to do projects on that. So it's linked to Library and Archives Canada, it's linked to Nova Scotia, and kids can do projects based on that and go beyond just number 2, but other soldiers as well.
Oh, I absolutely love that whole interactive thing and using Google Maps, and that's awesome. So we have time for 2 audience questions. Oh, this I think is a Kathy question right here. Does a photo exist that identifies the members of the number 2? Also, the same for their band, because this person would like to put names to faces. Are there photos, and where can people find them?
There is a famous photo that lists the members of number 2 band that were from the province of New Brunswick. And then there's another picture that was taken, I think, over in France that has members of the band. So I can share the names of the people who are on that, and I will send it in afterwards. And in regards to the other soldiers, we can get that information to you.
Great. And then, of course, you can go to Black Canadians veterans.com. You can go to that website and find more photos. Oh, that's a nice comment. I'm a Toronto District School Board grade 10 history teacher. Where can teachers find these videos to use in Unit 1 of the course?
Okay.
I think that's a Kathy question. That's not
Okay,
fair.
so for the videos, you can find it on the York Region District School Board, and we also have a series of videos that are on Black Canadian veteran stories.
Yeah, I think this is, oh, no. Yes. So one last question, I think all of you can answer this one. So what can be done to improve representation in the study and practice of military history? Yeah, we'll have Shelley answer that.
Oh, boy. I think, again, we need to continue to memorialize the stories of individuals before we lose them, because so many, and we have some photos of not that many years ago where regrettably there's only 1 or 2 of these veterans left. And in some cases, we've been able to capture their stories. In other cases, we haven't. So we've missed an opportunity to capture that for future learning. I think we've talked about events like this. We've talked about the work that Kathy does. We've talked about, what Kevin does. And I think we need to continue along those lines to spread the word, to generate the interest and the buzz in order to be able to, again, capitalize on social media and get the stories out there so that we can encourage others to learn, and then also talk to others one person at a time at the end of the day.
Mr. Clarke.
I think that the important thing for us all to remember is that the military is not separate from ourselves. Every citizen is potentially a combatant. Every citizen is potentially a soldier. And we may all have family members who are in one branch of the service or another. But the simple point and the major point is that the military is not separate from us. The military comes out of our society. It comes out of it's made up of our fellow and sister citizens. And it's under the direction of a democratically elected government that's supposed to fulfill the will of the people. And there's no decision is more dramatic than that of sending the nation to war. Or even to intervene in peace making efforts and so on. And so we should understand, teachers, students, all of us need to understand that everything the military does is a reflection of ourselves, is a reflection of the values of our society. And so therefore, we have to have a knowledge of the history of our engagements and to understand what is the right exercise of power and what is the wrong exercise of power. The military will reflect the highest values of the society so long as the society recognizes it has the right and the responsibility to impose those values on every branch of government.
Well said, well said.
I think Aretha Franklin had the answer for this. She said, RESPECT.
Preach.
Find out what it means to me.
Yes.
If we as a people, if we as a government respect the different cultures, right, then we will create an inclusive organization. That way, people will be represented because they feel respected. They feel accepted.
Thanks, Kevin. And I saved Kathy for last. If you can really just shrink it, because you are a public historian. I'm interested in the practice of military history.
Okay. We're all sitting in chairs here. We're part of a panel. Form a chair in Black Canadian military history. That's what I would like to see. I find now that there are different regiments that had Black members in their battalions, and they're reaching out and saying, you know what, I have 2 people who are in my unit. I have whatever. So sharing that information from the regiment, getting information from the descendants, getting the children involved. I think social media is one of the ways that we can get the information. I would love to see another event at the Moore Museum or the Museum of History, gather information, and I think that's what.
Well, thank you very much. That's a wonderful. Oh,
very quickly. I also
very quickly. 30 seconds.
I just want to see a whole lot more statues and monuments, for crying out loud. Statues and monuments. And if we want them, we'll have them.
Okay, you heard it here. You're lobbying for statues and monuments. All right, and a chair in Black Canadian military history. That is fabulous. So that wraps up our Q&A and our panel discussion. And yeah, I will ask Dean Oliver to close our wonderful program. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, everyone. Clearly, the War Museum will be busy in the years to come. I want to thank our panel for tonight's timely, emotional, thought-provoking discussion. There have been many groups in this room, many VIPs, many distinguished visitors. None that I can recall honor us more than you do with your presence, your memories, and your stories. Your insights tonight, your service, the tales, the agenda you've plotted, and your ongoing research will influence the field of military history in Canada for many years to come. I should tell you that the War Museum is currently working with the Niagara Military Museum, both to extend Community at War's showing here in Ottawa and to create from it a national traveling exhibition of Black military history to tour Canada in the years to come. I want to thank all of you who have made this event possible tonight, including, I should say, the program and learning team that serve both of us at the War Museum and the Canadian Museum of History, and who are responsible for so many of our fine events. Finally, and certainly not least, thank you, all of our viewers, for choosing to be with us tonight. I wish you a good evening wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully right here at events just like this. Now, to close the evening, I invite Dr. Clarke to recite his own poem titled, "They Trooped the Colors." Good evening, Dr. Clarke.
They trooped the colors. Men of the number 2 Construction Battalion, Canadian, Yankee, West Indian, sailed and marched to trenches on 2 fronts. Battle they had to twice, not once. Fought they to join in the Great War, defeat the foe, and win sweet honor. And they sought to wrought equality, the human right to civil dignity, to down those who supremacy craved, believing Africans best off enslaved or oppressed. But these soldiers de couleur proved no human being is inferior and established there's never true peace unless each society knows true justice. These men, Canadian, Yankee, West Indian, African, were all of liberty's dominion. These men, Canadian, Yankee, West Indian, African, were all of liberty's dominion.